COVID has changed the way we work forever. Some of us enjoy working from home, some crave a full-time return to the office, while a global survey of 10,000 office workers found 85% would prefer to work remotely a few days a week. Peter Wilkinson, this presents an enormous challenge for bosses everywhere. I'm sure many are scratching their heads wondering, what's the solution?
Yes, so we're facing a classic disrupted situation on the understanding that we're not going to go back to the old ways. And by the way, I used to believe that after COVID was over, we'd all go back to the office in the traditional way because we've been doing it for 150 years. And so we've got pretty good ways of working in an office culture. But I now believe, certainly for people in our area, so professional services, lawyers, accountants, we won't go back to what we used to. And so the way I look at it is I structure it in terms of what is the aim of the group and then drop it down into objectives. And I look at, for each stakeholder, I look at an objective. And so the aim of the group might be to be highly productive, but it also might be to finish a particular project in record time. So it just depends, you need to be very clear on what the aim is. But then you can drop down to each stakeholder and look at an objective. And it might be to make sure that we're productive, to make sure that we've got a strong culture, despite the fact that we're not together all the time, to make sure that each individual is productive and feels productive, to make sure that each individual's mental health is where it should be, and then maybe to make sure that families are working properly in this new environment where everybody's at home with two parents working and kids and dogs and cats and chaos. So that's the way I'd structure it, and each one of those you can get strategic and tactical.
So that's the next step, is tactics. How do we actually achieve our objectives to fulfill our aim? So how do we go about, people talk about productivity and mental health, they're all buzzwords, particularly at the moment, but how do we actually go about in achieving those objectives?
So that it is really irritating, the use of buzzwords, and I'm guilty as accused. The first thing is to remember in productivity, we are only as good as our people. Excuse me, another buzz phrase, but people are everything. And the second is that people want to know why they are doing things. And when you're remote, it's much harder to understand the mission and the purpose behind what the company is doing. People always look to their boss, not only to hear what they say, to get guidance, but to respond to how they behave. And in an office situation, you're watching your boss always very closely for the cues. And if you're not getting that by being face-to-face or in the same office environment, you've got to get it some other way. And then the high group productivity, the difficulty is aligning everyone on the strategy. So that becomes more complex, and you've got to look at ways of doing that.
And it's on that point, it's very hard on Zoom, particularly in larger groups where everybody may not get a say. How do you combat that?
So the way we do it is to break it down into smaller teams. And within this, so what you don't want is a team meeting where half the people are on their iPhone texting away while the leader's talking. You don't want that. So you break it down into more intimate teams. But as well as that, you can have an identified mentor to a small group of people. And even more intimately, you can set up buddy situations so that I'm buddying with you, or maybe you and I are buddying with a third person. So we are sort of forming closer collaborations, sort of virtually going down for a cup of coffee, that kind of thing. So there are ways of doing this, and it's very individual. The way a group of actuarial professionals might do it might be different to the way a bunch of marketing executives or advertising executives might do it.
And keeping everybody engaged and connected, that helps with the team culture. And again, culture is another buzzword, but it's so important and so hard to maintain through COVID and through FaceTime and Zoom and all of those remote working apps.
So we look at ways to innovate, and sometimes instead of having a meeting, you can make it a bit more lively and maybe give it a different name. Call your session a festival on occasions, and also have a get together once a month that isn't a Zoom call. Have an actual face-to-face get together once a month, where in the old days being over 6 months ago, you wouldn't necessarily often have the boss organising and paying for an event where you can go and have a few drinks and just sort of sit around and joke and chat and then go off and play up late into the night if you want to. But now, because we're in a different era, we've got to look at different ways of keeping the culture strong and keeping people interested in what's going on.
And that feeds into, we all want something to look forward to, whether that's in our personal lives or the holiday, but at work as well, having something to look forward to. So that's also really important in trying to keep that group dynamic strong.
So you're right, but also it's keeping individual productivity high. And now in our business, we can measure productivity every day because we work on an hourly rate, and so it's very easy. But for bosses with people working remotely, where that is not the traditional way of recording productivity, bosses are going to have to look at another way of recording KPIs, and people who aren't used to having KPIs recorded that way are going to have to get used to it. Because when you're working remotely, bosses have to be able to measure when your mental health goes down. And you can measure that in the work output, or you can measure that in other behaviours, in the tone of conversations, the level of engagement in Zoom calls, the level of attendance to social gatherings, those kinds of things. And a boss with a high emotional intelligence will be able to pick up on that stuff. And so it may mean that bosses have to go off to re-education camp and learn, those who haven't naturally got high emotional intelligence, high intuitive sense of how people are travelling with their work and their private lives, need to go off and get a bit of training on that. But also there's an onus on the employee to put their hand up. And so, as you know, in our company, we have sessions where people actually talk about their feelings. And I know that's an uncomfortable thing, particularly for blokes to do, that a bit too touchy-feely. But once you start doing it, it's hugely helpful for people to make them feel good about themselves and good about the group.
And then, of course, there's a complexity of people working at home and having their families involved, which certainly complicates matters.
Traditionally, there's a separation between work and home. And there's been sort of either an explicit or implied understanding that you leave your work at work and you go home and care for the family. But now, when everybody's working from home and there's a completely changed environment, I'm particularly sensitive about the women or the person who's the traditional child carer, because if the person is now working from home, they're torn in all directions. So there's a real sense, there's a potential for a feeling of guilt, whereas it was, you could stick the kids into childcare and go off to the office and have a break. Well, if that's no longer such a flexible option, then you've got this pressure cooker environment at home that people need to be self-aware about, but also bosses need to be aware about.
Yes, flexibility, understanding and empathy will play a key role in keeping staff happy, motivated and productive. It will be very interesting to see where we end up over the next 6 to 12 months. Peter Wilkinson, thank you.